I am currently obsessed with the musical 1776. So you might be able to guess from the title, but 1776 is a musical about the Declaration of Independence. Specifically, we follow John Adams as the main character as he persuades other members of Congress to vote in favor of independence. The music and lyrics are by Sherman Edwards, and the screenplay is by Peter Stone. The show premiered on Broadway in 1969, and during its run it did pretty well, and even won 3 Tony Awards, including Best Musical. After that, a movie adaptation was made in 1972, featuring many of the original Broadway cast, and the show had a short revival in 1976 for the US bicentennial. However, since then, it's kind of been out of the spotlight as other musicals have come onto Broadway. Because, let's be real here. A musical on US history? Really, how popular can this stuff be?
So he knows what to do in the trench, ingenuity and fluent in French, so you're gonna have to use him eventually. What's he gonna do on the bench, No one has more resilience or matches my practical, tactical brilliance. You want to fight for your land back? I need my right-hand man back. Yeah, get your right-hand man back. You know you gotta get your right-hand man back. You gotta put some thought into the letter, but the sooner the better to get your right-hand man back.
So, US history is cool again, and after the success of the musical Hamilton, 1776 is expecting a revival on Broadway in 2021. So I decided to check it out to see what it's all about. Now I am completely obsessed with the musical and need to talk about it. So here I am, talking to you. So here's a historical review of the musical 1776. How much is historically accurate and how much is up to artistic liberty. Disclaimer, I am not an expert in US history, nor am I an expert in musicals. But I know how to Google, so let's get started. The musical opens with John Adams hanging out at the top of the bell tower in Independence Hall, Philadelphia. John Adams was played by William Daniels in both the original Broadway production as well as in the film version. Now, at the time, the building was not called Independence Hall, obviously, since they were not independent yet. It was called the Pennsylvania State House. In present day, the capital of Pennsylvania is Harrisburg. Before that, it was in Lancaster. But back in 1776, the state capital of Pennsylvania was Philadelphia. Back to the story, we see a man come up the bell tower. This is Andrew McNair.
I'm Andrew McNair, Congressional custodian.
Andrew McNair was the custodian/doorkeeper at Independence Hall. He's a real historical figure. According to the records of the American Philosophical Society, Andrew McNair was hired on March 22nd, 1768 to make the fires, light and extinguish the candles, and keep the meeting room clean for 4 shillings a day. He was also in charge of ringing the bell. The Liberty Bell was simply known as the State House Bell. The whole symbolism and name associated with the bell today was adopted during the abolitionist movement. Back to the story, Adams goes back downstairs and expresses his dissatisfaction that his colleagues have not voted on the most important matter on hand, the question of independence. We then hear the first song of the musical and maybe the most iconic, Sit Down, John.
Thomas, for God's sake, listen to me.
Now, you may recognize this line even if you haven't seen 1776 yet, because it inspired this line in the musical Hamilton.
Sit down, John, you fat mother...
Anyways, we see in this number that John Adams is very passionate about independence, and he is trying to convince his colleagues to vote.
I say vote yes, vote yes, vote for independence.
So is it true that Adams was one of the most vocal advocates for independence? John Adams was a lawyer, and like any good lawyer, he put his trust in the rule of law. So much so that he decided to represent the British soldiers in the trial against 8 British officers for firing at a crowd of Americans during the Boston Massacre. Although eventually Adams became one of the biggest proponents of independence, earlier in the Revolution, he was in favor of finding peace with Britain. I have to admit, John Adams in this musical sounds a little bit more like his rebel cousin, Sam Adams.
Ooh, I'm a rebel just for
There were over 50 members in the Second Continental Congress. However, in the musical, less than half that number is represented. John Adams is the only member of the Massachusetts delegation that we see. However, in reality, his cousins Sam Adams, Robert Payne, and Elbridge Gerry were all present at the time. The character of John Adams that we see in the musical is more of a composite character between John Adams, Sam Adams, and other members of Congress who were pro-independence. Back to the story, it does seem like there is an intense debate going on, but it's not about independence.
Too many flies, too many flies.
This is such a great song. It shows that there's already a lot of tension between the delegates, and that they are so disharmonious that they can't even agree on whether to open the window or not. Politicians never change, always arguing about something useless.
Of military history. What?
It's too hot.
The weather conditions that we see throughout the musical are all accurate. Thomas Jefferson was recording the temperature twice a day and left a meticulous record. When it's shown to be rainy or sunny, these are all based on Jefferson's records. Going back to the musical, we see that Adams becomes frustrated and leaves Independence Hall. Adams then sings Piddle, Twiddle, and Resolve.
Dear God. For 1 solid year, they have been sitting here. A whole year, doing nothing.
This is an exposition song telling you what's been happening in Congress up to this point. We then transition to a song called Till Then. This is a duet between Abigail Adams and John Adams.
Just tell the Congress to declare independence, then sign your name, get out of there and hurry home to me.
Abigail Adams is John Adams' wife. Her and the children were at the family farm while John Adams was in Philadelphia. You could say that John and Abigail were #couple goals. They wrote to each other frequently, sometimes up to 4 times a day. They would tease and poke fun at each other.
Oh, well, there you have me, John. I'm afraid you are pig-headed.
But they would also discuss very serious issues. John Adams would frequently ask Abigail for her advice on political matters. John and Abigail never physically meet during the musical. Their duets are all songified versions of their correspondence. In this duet, they discuss the children's well-being, and Adams checks up on a favor that he had asked his wife.
I asked you to organize the ladies to make saltpeter for gunpowder. Now, have you done as I asked?
No, John, I have not.
By the way, this request is not made up. John Adams really did ask his wife to try to make some saltpeter, to which Abigail Adams replied on April 5th, 1776, "You inquire of whether I am making saltpeter. I have not yet attempted it." Saltpeter is one of the main ingredients in gunpowder. There was a major lack of gunpowder during the American Revolution, and it was one of the biggest problems that the army faced. The colonies had always relied on Britain to import saltpeter for gunpowder, and therefore did not have a domestic gunpowder industry. However, desperate times call for desperate measures, and saltpeter could be made from human waste. An interesting fact that I read was during the Civil War, women in the South would collect their own urine to help in the production of saltpeter. Another article claiming that in the 17th century, people would go to scrub the church floor, since apparently women would pee themselves during church services. I'm not sure if this inside joke was intended by the writers, but I like to believe that John Adams was essentially asking his wife to collect urine from her and her lady friends. Anyways, Abigail leverages this favor by asking John to send some pins.
Well, we will not make saltpeter until you send us pins.
Pins, madam. Saltpeter.
Pins.
Saltpeter.
Pins.
Saltpeter.
Pins.
Saltpeter.
Pins.
Again, a genuine request that actually happened. On June 16th, 1775, Abigail Adams wrote, "The cry for pins is so great that what we used to buy for 7.6 are now 20 shillings. As one of only 2 female characters in the musical, it's great to see Abigail Adams assert herself and negotiate with her husband. If you have the time, please go and read some of the letters John and Abigail wrote to each other. It's actually really cute. After the duet, we see the following morning, and John Adams is looking for Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin was a proponent of independence, so he and Adams should have been on the same side. However, in real life, they were not very close. Ben Franklin felt that John Adams was too outspoken and passionate, whilst Adams felt that Franklin was too easygoing and aloof. Indeed, Franklin was probably a better politician, better at manipulating people and saying the right thing. We get to see this part of Benjamin Franklin during the next scene, where he convinces Richard Henry Lee to propose independence. This because nobody will vote for independence when John Adams is the one who's proposing it.
Nobody listens to you. You're obnoxious and disliked.
It's a joke throughout the musical that John Adams is obnoxious and disliked.
He's obnoxious and disliked. Did you know that? I hadn't heard.
This comes from Adams's own words. On August 6, 1822, John Adams wrote a letter to Timothy Pickering. In the letter, he reminisces on his time in the Second Continental Congress and why Adams pushed for Jefferson to write the Declaration of Independence rather than write it himself. In his list of reasons, he wrote, "I am obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular." As I mentioned, this letter was written in 1822, close to 50 years after the fact. Now, there were many contemporaries that did find Adams obnoxious, most famously Alexander Hamilton. However, he was generally respected by most members of Congress. His reputation took a hit during his vice presidency and really started to go down during his presidency. Adams's presidency was famously one of the most unpopular. He lost his re-election campaign to Thomas Jefferson and became the first president in U.S. history to only serve one term. There are many reasons why Adams's presidency was unpopular, but you gotta cut the guy some slack. John Adams came right after George Washington, the only president that was elected unanimously. Back to the story, we get to meet Richard Henry Lee.
My name is Richard Henry Lee. Virginia is my home. My name is Richard Henry Lee. Virginia is my home.
Lee plays an important role in U.S. history because his proposal to declare independence from England sets into motion the debates that will lead to the adoption of the Declaration of Independence. In the musical, Lee is a very flamboyant character. In real life, Lee was a real rebel and became a close ally of Sam Adams and John Adams. He was known as a great orator and had a musical voice. He, like many other founding fathers, came from an aristocratic background.
For I am F.F.V., the first family in the sovereign colony of Virginia.
FFV stands for the First Families of Virginia. They were a group of wealthy aristocratic families who traced their lineage back to Jamestown, Williamsburg, and early settlements in the Virginia colony. It was English custom for the first son to inherit the father's land. This led many of the second sons of noble English families to come to the new colonies to secure land for themselves. George Washington can trace his lineage back to Edward I. So I mean, low-key, if he wanted to, he could have been the king of the United States of America, but... Anyways, the Lee family was a part of this elite group. They produced many military and political characters throughout history.
Look out! It's Arthur Lee, Bobby Lee, General Light Horse Harry Lee, Willie Lee, Jesse Lee,
And Richard H.
that's me.
Speaking of famous Lees, the Confederate General Robert E. Lee was the son of Light Horse Harry Lee, mentioned earlier in the song. The scene concludes with Richard Henry Lee galloping back to Virginia to get permission from the Virginia legislature to publicly support independence. So that is it for part 1 of my review on 1776. I hope you enjoyed it and keep an eye out for part 2.